Our panel this morning, the first one that we have, is called How to Write a Bestseller. I'd like you to put your hands together for our guests. They are, in order, Louise Ross, Mark Dawson and Hazel Gaynor. Louise, I'm going to start with you, maybe briefly for all three of you, for people who are watching this morning. Explain how you became involved in the world of independent publishing and where things have gone from there.
Okay, well, I mean, first of all, I used to be a lawyer, so it's a second career for me, which I think is quite usual for people as well, you know, whether you're coming at it from a first career or a second career perspective. But in my case, I was working in the City of London, and I had come to a point in my life where I thought, you know, I really want to do something different. I want to be more creative. So I left that career behind. And there was a sort of a small pause in my thinking because actually we became pregnant with my son. So during the period of maternity leave, it was absolutely ideal because I started writing my book and started putting pen to paper, as it were, and thinking about, you know, all of those ideas that I'd been secretly squirreling away in the intervening years.
You know, you say that's really easy. Doing it during maternity leave, I would imagine, would be the hardest thing imaginable.
Well, yeah, I was sort of glossing over that, but you're right. I mean, you have to kind of pick your moments, put it that way. In those precious times when he was having a nap and things like that, I was penning some ideas, or, you know, when I wasn't napping myself. So, yeah, it all came together, and it was sort of stop and start for me because of that period, but by, I think it was January 2015, I had a manuscript ready, and, you know, initially not really knowing very much about the industry, I came at it from a very traditional perspective originally, and I sent it out to, I think it was a mere 12 agents and publishers who would accept direct submissions, which now with hindsight is a very, very small number. And actually was very fortunate because I had a couple of offers come through, which I ultimately rejected in favour of publishing independently through Amazon.
Okay. Mark, tell us your story. How did you end up here?
Well, I also used to be a lawyer in the City of London, and I decided to do something else too. I was originally published traditionally by Macmillan in the UK in 1999, 2000, that kind of time. Found the experience was fun up to a point, and it was the kind of the high point was seeing my books on the shelves in the local bookstore. On the wrong shelves, unfortunately, down the bottom, so because I moved them back up to eye line, and then the next day they were back down again. Weird that, but it was fun up to that point. But I didn't feel that the marketing there wasn't much marketing that I could see. So they didn't sell particularly well. I actually stopped writing for 7 or 8 years, and it was only when a friend of mine at the job I'd moved to told me that he'd written something and published it independently on the Kindle, that I thought that sounded interesting. So I got back into it again, and since then I've written 20 books, I think, in the last 7 or 8 years, and you know, and a couple of series that are doing quite well. Had some film deals, audiobooks, everything. It's been a fantastic journey.
Can I ask you, was your friend also a lawyer?
No, he wasn't a lawyer.
Just checking there's not a pattern here. Okay. Hazel, you've kind of gone in the opposite direction.
Well, I have to say there's definitely a pattern because I used to work for a law firm.
Didn't know that? Okay.
So the tip for the day is be associated with law or something. So I was working for one of the big law firms in Dublin and was made redundant in 2009. So I, similarly to Louise, this is very much a second career for me. Found myself at home with 2 very young children, and you might call it a midlife crisis. I think of it as a midlife epiphany. It's like, what do I do next? I've always loved writing. I've always had ideas, but I didn't know how to go about writing or where to start. So I started to write about that transition from being a career woman to being what was termed at the time as a stay-at-home mom. And I found I had an awful lot to say about that. So that was my way into writing. I wrote a blog, and I wrote freelance articles for parenting magazines. And that then gave me a voice, and I think from that I realised I had more to say about other things. So I started to work on a novel. That novel is still in my bottom drawer. I think every author has one, my learning book, as I call it. But writing that novel, the experience of sitting down, of getting up in the wee small hours of the morning before the children to writing when they'd gone to bed, finding that time when you can write. And then I started to write what became my first published novel, The Girl Who Came Home, which was about the Titanic. And what I hadn't realised when I started to write that book was that 2012 was going to be the centenary of the sinking of the Titanic. So I found myself with a book about the Titanic and this huge media event and the centenary anniversary that was coming. Went out on submission, got lots of very positive feedback, but publishing traditionally as it works, I was too late. So any publisher who was going to publish a novel about the Titanic would have had that bought 2 years previous. So for me, publishing independently was a fantastic opportunity as an unknown author with a novel about the Titanic, with this event happening, to get myself out there. So I took a bit of a leap of faith, and it turned out to be the best thing I could have done, because it was a #1 bestseller on Amazon, and it went on to become a New York Times bestseller when it became traditionally published. And I've now had 2 New York Times bestsellers, and I'm on my 4th novel. So, silver lining, I think you'd say.
Yeah. I mean, the name of this panel is How to Write a Bestseller, so I'm mostly going to be asking you guys about writing and about writing process, but maybe just before we leave that, was it hard or easy to get your work seen once you'd published it online? Because for some people, they can find that a hard process, getting your work out there.
Well, I mean, I think for me, I was incredibly lucky because it was my first novel, and I had no expectations whatsoever, about visibility, or, it was very new to the whole process online. But I published it through Amazon KDP on the 1st of January 2015, and by May it had reached the #1 spot on the UK Kindle store. And I think that what I would say is that it was something that gathered momentum. So, initially I'd had a blog which I'd set up in anticipation of releasing it. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, I didn't even have that many followers, but I had some who were loyal and went on to buy the book when it first came out. And I think that, it's a case of increments. And then by, say, May, Amazon reached out and said, well, by that stage the book had already reached maybe about 180 in the chart on its own Steam. Mm-hmm. And then Amazon reached out and said, look, would you like to put this book on a promotion, which they do all the time with people, and everyone's got a chance of that. So it's very much a kind of open playing field. And so I said, of course, great. Sort of half forgot about it because I thought, well, I'm up against people like, Stephen King, Jeffrey Archer. And I was thinking, this isn't really going to happen for me. But I think I checked online the next day, and it had gone from being, say, 180 up to, 80. So it had already jumped. And then the day after that, it was up to 40. And then it was just over the course of a couple of days, it was absolutely riding. So I think it's just a case of there are individual stories. But after that first book, it just made life a lot easier with every book that came after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mark, the same question in terms of once you've actually written something and you've managed to get it published out there, where does the process go from you? How was that?
You have to know when to take off your writer's hat and put on your business person's hat. That's very important. The odds of a lightning strike happening where you upload a book and then cross your fingers, the odds of that getting any kind of sales is slim. It does happen, but it's unlikely. So you need to know when to switch gears and start to promote it and market it. So I'm quite fortunate. I enjoy both parts of the business about as much as the other one. So I'm quite big on things like harvesting email addresses from readers. So as someone reads my book, I'll offer them something for free. So another book, perhaps the second in the series, I'll give them that for free in exchange for them giving me their email address, because a sale to me is great, but it's not as important as a subscription, because once I've got someone's email address and I can correspond with them directly, I can then sell them. I can tell them when I've got a new book to sell. So that's very important. Building up your mailing list is the first most important thing that new writers should do as soon as they're ready to publish.
Because it is a crucial thing, and maybe not everybody realises this. When they think of promoting online or through social, they think of the traditional social media platforms, but sometimes mailing lists can be the most targeted way of doing that.
No question. Email is it's 20 years old now, but email is still the most powerful way of reaching out to your readership. I'm quite big on Facebook as well, so we can talk about advertising and social media stuff later perhaps, but the most important thing to do is to immediately start to get those email addresses, and then to start to, I see it as an equation. So as they come in, they're perhaps their browsers. You turn them into readers, then you turn them into fans, then you turn them into friends. When you get them to the end of that process, and I've got readers now who send me Christmas cards, and when you get to that kind of process, apart from being incredibly gratifying to have people prepared to do that, you've got people who'll buy the rest of your books when you put them out, and that's the foundation.
And Hazel, again, that's the question. You did have the book. It was 2012. It was the centenary, but I'm sure it was a crowded marketplace in terms of things that were connected to the Titanic.
Yeah, and I think that proves that if you have a good idea, there can be lots of very good ideas that are about the same subject. So, some people had discouraged me from approaching the book to be independently published, and with that subject matter, it had already been done. But I think, what's important to go back to, even before you get your book out there and that it's visible, is to really focus on the book, on the writing. Ultimately, you can have all the email lists and the best social media campaign money can buy or not. In my case, I had zero budget. It was literally me, a laptop, my kitchen table, and a bit of moral support from the family. And I think you have to be very, very careful not to forget about, at the end of it all, you will be judged on the content of that book. And publishing independently should in no way mean that you don't take that as seriously and take your time. I think the temptation, and that's the fantastic thing about publishing independently, you can tap into something like a centenary event or whatever it might be. You can go now. You don't have to wait for that long 18-month, 2-year cycle that a traditional publishing house would have to go through. But I would always slightly caution against jumping too quickly at the expense of the quality of the book. So I invested in having the book professionally edited, getting a professional cover designed to make my product as professional as it would have been. I became a publishing house. I was all of the bits. And I think once you are absolutely confident that this is the best book you can actually make it, then start thinking about your social media, your email marketing list, thinking about other ways, being clever, just being a little bit savvy about what's happening now. Is there something happening today, a news item that you can tap into because your book matches the content of that?
Sure.
And you can be very spontaneous and very immediate. Obviously, in terms of looking at your sales, looking at your pricing, you can adjust things today, tomorrow. So the control that you have, I found, was fantastic. As a debut author, floundering, finding my feet and trying to find my way, you're not committed to sticking with a price for a year. You can try things out and see what works and find your readers, and then you can start engaging with them.
Okay, again, for people who are tweeting, if you fancy tweeting us a question, it's hashtag KDPDublin, or you can just get to the writing.ie Twitter account and ask Vanessa a question here, which we'll be doing later on. Okay, business hats off, writer's hats on. I'll start with you again, Louise. One of the most crucial things we're always told is about grabbing your reader in the space of the first paragraph or page or even line sometimes. Yes. How do you go about that?
Well, it's something I spend probably the most amount of time on, actually. So first 3 chapters, certainly, because that's what, if you're on the Amazon store, people can look inside the book. So first 3 chapters, but in particular, as you say, the first couple of pages apart from anything else. So say with my first book, Holy Island, I was less aware of this, but I think that, even as I was writing a prologue in that book. And I must have done about 4 or 5, maybe 6 different drafts. And the first one, you think it's your baby, it's brilliant, it can't get better than this, which is, of course, rubbish, because, of course, it can. You can go through the whole editing process. But, something that you can read and from a very literary perspective might be brilliant, and you think, wow, this is the best thing I've ever written. That's not necessarily going to hook a reader. It's not necessarily going to match the genre that you're writing. And at the end of the day, I was writing murder mysteries. That's what my series is. So there has to be pace, there has to be atmosphere, and all of the kind of things that are going to hook somebody who enjoys that kind of book. And actually, what I tried to remember was that, first and foremost, I'm a reader. It's what I enjoyed reading myself, which is why I turned to writing it. And I know from my own experience that if I pick up a book and it's just slow, or it doesn't have anything interesting, or perhaps the language or the style just isn't something that I can really fall into, then I'm probably not going to read it myself. And the thing about it is that it's kind of like being on a sofa like this, and someone shows you the family album, and you're stuck in the middle of 2 people, and people kind of nod and smile politely, don't they? But you can't escape. But if you're sitting with a book at home, people can just put it down. There's no obligation whatsoever for people to continue reading it, and you won't necessarily know why. You just won't get the click-throughs. So I think for me, definitely something that I would invest a lot of time in. Ask around your family and friends. Obviously, as Hazel says, second stage is professional editing. But, just be honest with yourself as well and look at it as objectively as you can and think, is this something that would really grab me? If you have to, put it in a drawer and come back to it a month later or something like this with fresh eyes.
Because it is one of those things that happens to most readers. Yeah. And certainly, I'm a browser in shops. I'll go in, I will blatantly open the first couple of pages of a book I like the look of. And sometimes, if it doesn't grab me in the first page or two, you can end up putting it back down, and that's that. Mark, how do you go about grabbing people in the first couple of pages?
I don't think I do it kind of consciously. I think I've written enough now that it's usually something that's quite instinctive for me. But it's all about pace. But I write kind of fairly fast thrillers. So, and I'll usually start with a fairly exciting scene, something that I know that people will want to continue to read. So one of the last one I published, called The Jungle, starts with a woman wakes up, finds herself in a box, which turns out it's a coffin, and she's been. It's about people smuggling and refugees and things like that, and she finds out she's basically been smuggled across the border in a coffin, and that's also something that's quite primal. It's something that people are frightened about, the idea of being buried alive and all that kind of stuff. So I knew that would be something that once, it's quite a short, maybe 2-page prologue. I knew that once people got to the end of that, they'd want to know, what happens, how does she get there, how does she get out, all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, it's pacing, it's inciting incidents, and just trying to get people to continue to turn the pages. And what about you, Hazel? Is it something you're very conscious of when you're writing?
I think I'm more conscious of it now. Yeah, I think when I first started out, just to write a whole novel of 100,000 words was such a huge prospect, and it seems like an impossible task most of the time until you finish. So for me, I often don't write the first line until I've written the end, because I'm not a plotter. I'd have a loose idea of the arc of my story, but it's only when I've written that first draft, which I always think of as telling myself the story, and once I've done that, I can then go back and think about this as a reader. How do I keep them turning the page? How do I keep the pacing? And that's when all your rewriting and redrafting and structural changes come in to take those component parts of your story but put them in the right order. And I'll look at each chapter, and I'll look at the first and the last line of each chapter. So not just the start of the book and the end of the book, but think of each chapter as a mini book, so that's how you're going to keep somebody turning the page at the end of the chapter, but you're hooking them again or keeping them interested for the next chapter. And because I write historical fiction, I'm also very conscious of taking my reader into that era where I'm setting. So that's something I'd be very aware of in the first 3 chapters, is to place and setting. Where are we? Is a really important part of investing my reader in that time and place. So I'd be quite conscious of that as well.
Okay. Louise, now that Hazel's mentioned it, we may as well, I was going to ask about it later on anyway, about story arc. Because for some people, when they start writing, it can be quite intimidating, the whole idea of trying to find an entire arc of a story. Maybe they think they have a good idea, maybe they think they have the nub of something, but then trying to think of how you plot that over an entire... Do you plot story arc beforehand? Is it something that comes to you as you're writing?
Well, with the first book, I didn't actively plot an entire story at all. But I was writing for myself mostly. It was a very sort of liberating experience, and it was the first time out of the block, so I sort of took a bit longer on it. It stopped and start. It was coming very organically. I think that, as Mark said earlier, it starts to become a bit more instinctive the more that you write. So at times, if there's more of a complicated story that I have in my mind, the idea of it, then I like to have the bones of the story sort of fairly clear. But I'm not somebody who plots scene to scene. I know of some writers, and it is just a question of what works for you. For me, it's more that I just like to have the skeleton of a story, and then it's part of the fun of it is really kind of building the bones around it, So I kind of prefer to just see where the story takes me around it, so long as it's following the main storyline. And it's quite important, I think, that you check beforehand that there aren't going to be any problems, particularly with a mystery book. So say there's no inconsistencies in the storyline and things like that, because the last thing you want to do is what I did with my second book, which is come to the middle of the story, realise that you'd slightly gone off track, just enjoying yourself, you know, like Jessica Fletcher, and realising that you had to cut 30,000 words and rewrite it. So it happens, and you sometimes have to kill your baby, as it were. But if it's for the better long-term good of the story, then that's what you're wanting. So.
And Mark, are you one of those people who has a board that has cards on it with little pins and things plotted out?
Virtually, yeah. I use a piece of software called Scrivener. So I don't know. Do you guys use Scrivener?
No, I'm like
your
Microsoft Word.
Okay. There's two ways of doing this. But something like Word is not designed for writing 100,000 word texts. It's not, the navigation's not ideal for that. There's a piece of software called Scrivener that's quite popular now within the writing community, and what it does, it enables you to write in scenes, and then effectively it's very, very powerful, but one of the things you can do is have a virtual corkboard, and then you can move things around. So that has enabled me, so the book I'm writing at the moment, I'm kind of slightly, I'm part plotting, and part the kind of alternative to plotting is what they call pantsing, so writing by the seat of your pants. So I'm somewhere in between.
That's a new term to me. That's great. I haven't heard that before. Pantsing.
Plotting and pantsing. Yeah. So I'm a kind of a plotter / pantser. Didn't think I'd say that in the morning on Saturday. No. But what it allows you to do is to write in scenes and then to juggle them around. So at the moment, I might wake up on Monday and decide I want to write a dialogue-heavy scene. So I can go somewhere towards the end of the book, start to write that, and then I might decide to do an action scene, and I can go backwards and write that, and then I might decide that they need to be reordered slightly, and it's just as simple as dragging and dropping. So you effectively take the index card off the corkboard, move it around, and play with it that way. It's a really flexible piece of software that just enables you. I can write much quicker that way, just by depending on what I want to write that day.
Okay. Hazel, plotter or pantser?
Pantser, definitely
Okay.
a pantser. Yeah, I've always looked at it as if I plot it out too much, it kind of feels like homework, and I feel I have to go and write that scene, and it takes some of the joy out for me out of writing. For me, when I'm pantsing, is that a technical term? When I'm pantsing along, I often don't know what's going to happen next, and that's part of the fun. That's what keeps me writing for that 100,000 words, because I'm not always sure what's going to happen next. I'm not very technical. I don't use Scrivener. A lot of people have talked to me about it. I'm quite happy with Word. It kind of works. I'm afraid to try something else. Sort of how much writing time would that take up to get into it? My least technical plotting method for writing my latest novel, The Girl from the Savoy, was my kids' snooker table, which is up in our attic where I write. And I got coloured Post-it notes, which work really well for me. It's quite a visual technique. And each colour is a character. So I literally map out, it just happened to be a snooker table because it's their playroom as well. So I mapped out my plot. And very visually I can see where's the balance for each character. And you can move things around. And then I would rewrite that plot into my Word document. But it's all about rewriting. And I think when I first started, I was a little afraid of taking out huge chunks of my manuscript. I'd now use what I have as an outtakes file, so I never delete anything. It's like a cut scene or a deleted scene, and I've sometimes used those to promote a book. Mm-hmm. Here's a scene I took out, which is quite a nice thing readers like to see as well. So you never lose anything completely, but sometimes just physically taking it out of your document lets you see it a lot clearer. You have to be really tough with yourself. You might adore what you've written and think it's beautiful and perfect or very pacey, but it might not have any place in that book. So you really do have to try and step back from it, get readers to read your work. Don't be afraid of letting people see. I know Stephen King says write your first draft with the door closed, write your second draft with the door open. And I really believe in that, and getting crit partners, getting readers to just see your work and help you, and that really helps me because I'm not a plotter. I don't always know, so they can help me see where I might need to develop something.
do you ever take those outtake scenes and then end up using them somewhere else in a completely different context?
I've used elements of them, definitely. I wrote a short story, or a novella, a 10,000-word short story in an anthology, which I used an element of an outtake from The Girl from the Savoy and developed that character, and that became a short story, Hush, in Fall of Poppies. So that's why I say nothing's ever wasted, and you can be very proud of that scene or those words that you've written, but you just have to ask yourself, does that have any place in my book? And particularly for me with historical research, probably 70% of my research has no place in the book. It's just in my head.
Okay. Remember, if you are watching online, you can use the hashtag KDP Dublin or the new hashtag Pantsing if you want to throw that out there, or you can send any questions you have to the writing.ie Twitter account. Now that we're there, now that we're in the area of ideas, sometimes for people, particularly perhaps if they're thinking about writing properly for the first time, the question is, with all of the ideas you have, which are the ones that are worth pursuing? How do you go about the process of going, yes, yes, no, no, no?
Well, for me, I mean, all of my mystery series is set up in Northumberland and the surrounding area in the northeast of England, which is where I'm from. So I really love the landscape, and all of the ideas kind of flow from there for me. And actually, every book is named after an area, and all of the covers are there. So whenever I go back up north, which is where my parents still live, I kind of do a little research trip. So I kind of visit somewhere that I went as a child, or go back to the coastline or something like this. And you know, for anyone who hasn't been to that part of England before, it's kind of famous for its industrial history. So it's got a lot of, you know, coal mines and shipbuilding and things like that. But for me, that was only part of its history. So what I try to do is sort of shine a light on some of the forgotten territories that people who even live there themselves have forgotten about, and myself included. So in terms of ideas, it's more like location shooting for me. I'll go around and take a drive and maybe just have a look at some of my old books on the region, actually historically as well, really looking into that. And it doesn't really take much to jump from that to start developing an idea about, in a mystery context, about dark deeds happening there. I mean, with the first one, it's a causal island set off the northeast coastline, which, you know, the tide rolls in twice a day, and, you know, you're cut off from the rest of the world. So it's classic kind of Agatha Christie territory. So it's not hard to sort of imagine a locked room mystery scenario from there. And, you know, in terms of sitting back at your desk and taking that idea and translating it onto the page, it's just a case of fiddling with it. You know, let it kind of cogitate and let it sort of ruminate in your mind. And eventually you'll come up with something that sort of brings in the elements of what you had and what you enjoyed about that, and that a reader will hopefully enjoy as well. And I think it is just sometimes just tweaking ideas, letting it sort of, you know, come together and not being frightened to maybe start writing it, find it doesn't work, alter certain areas as you go along. You know, I think you have to be adaptable with these things.
Has that ever happened frequently, that you've found an idea that you have started twiddling with, fiddling with, gone, yeah, there's something in this, moved it three steps down the line, and then reached a point where you've just gone, no? Not
so far. I mean, I think that, you know, for me, in terms of mystery writing, I mean, settings are great, and that's what gives me the initial inspiration. But I think that people, you know, in my view, readers kind of connect with the characters. So, you know, I think that if you're creating a story where, you know, whoever your criminal is and your mastermind is doing something that is essentially a human behavioral trait. I mean, there's so many things that people are going to use as excuses for example, murder. You know, there could be religious, political motivation, things like this. There are, I think, probably a finite number of reasons why people might commit the deeds that they do. So what I would say to people, if you are writing mysteries, for example, is not to be frightened to use a concept that has been used before, because there are just a finite number, but it's how you do it is original, and the setting and the circumstances are original.
Okay. Mark, I mean, same question. In terms of ideas, which ones make the grade and which ones don't? Is there a percentage as well of one to the other?
I think the most important thing is you've got to write what you want to read, and you'll enjoy writing. So after my second book was traditionally published, I thought I'd try and write kind of a really, well, dumb kind of thriller. And it was the only time I've ever had a problem sitting down to write. It was like pulling teeth. And that book, although I did finish it, it was a real struggle. And it was dreadful. It was really dreadful. And it was because my heart wasn't in it. So I think that's the most important thing. You've got to find something that you actually want to write. But the trick is then if you think of a Venn diagram between what you want to write and what you think the readers would like to read, if you get that sweet spot in the middle. And the thing with a place like Amazon, there's so much data available. It is possible using some reasonably simple techniques just to find out which genres have voracious enough readers within them, but they're perhaps not served with enough content. Mm-hmm. If you can find that kind of area, and it is something that you're interested in writing, that can be. You're certainly setting yourself off on the right foot, because you know that you'll be, once the book's finished, there's a good chance that people will be interested in getting into it.
And Hazel, again, which ideas make the grade, which ideas don't for you?
Well, I think it's important to probably acknowledge that not all ideas make good books. So, I'm an absolute history geek, and I love lots of different eras, lots of different historical figures, but not all of them are rounded enough for me to create a whole fictional retelling of. So I'd encourage people to maybe think about an idea, as Louise said, let it percolate. Don't just go rushing into it. Think about, what is your story arc going to be about that idea? How are you going to pitch that to your readers? What might a cover look like? Why is this slightly different to other books, novels around that subject matter? And if at the end of all that you're not 100% convinced, then it's maybe an idea to leave for a little bit longer. I would always distill it down to something I can sell very, very quickly. So, we often talk about the elevator pitch. So if you're trapped in an elevator with somebody and they say, what's your book about, between floors 10 and 1, or the other way around, you can tell them. So The Girl Who Came Home is an account of an Irish immigrant who survives the sinking of the Titanic. My second novel, A Memory of Violets, is a retelling of My Fair Lady and Pygmalion. And The Girl from the Savoy is Downton Abbey meets Cabaret. So if you can quickly...
You've got it down to a fine art by the time you've gotten to the third
Exactly,
one.
yeah.
Impressive.
It's got better. Yeah. But I think if you can quickly distill your idea down into something like that, it sounds crazy because you've then got to create 100,000 words or more around that. But there's the nugget that's going to work. And a lot of reaching out to readers, we were talking about how do you find readers. A lot of finding readers is very quickly telling them, be it through the book cover, the synopsis, the blurb that they will read, those lovely little sound bites that immediately puts an image of what that might be into somebody's mind, can all help elevate you in amongst that huge array of books online or in a shop.
Is it helpful when you're writing to have that nugget that you've created for yourself of, here's what the story is, to remind yourself that that's what you're aiming at?
Yes, absolutely. And that you keep going back to that, because by you reach that sort of muddy area of 40, 50,000 words where some of the initial enthusiasm's starting to wear off and you're not sure how are you going to get to the end and what was the premise of this book anyway. If you do have that to keep reminding yourself and going back to, that's the nugget, that's the story I'm telling my readers. And I find that really helps. But I've got lots of outtakes of ideas. I'm sort of percolating ideas at the moment for my 5th novel. The 4th one's just being edited. And it's, there's 2 or 3 that are vying for my attention. And I'm not quite sure which one's talking to me the loudest yet. I want to write them all. But it's also about building your brand and your career. So it would be a bit crazy for me at the moment to go and write a mystery, for example, because my readers want to follow me and go with me, and they know what they're going to get from me now. So there's a little bit of that as well.
Okay, each of you in one stage or another here has mentioned editing as being part of the process. For a lot of people who are thinking to start writing and start publishing, maybe online initially, that's a very scary word. That's a word that makes you think, how much is that going to cost me? I don't have the money to get an editor involved. How do I get that process? Is it important? What would you say to those people?
I would say it's definitely an integral part of it. I mean, first and foremost, maybe self-edit as you're going along. I mean, I know there's a lot of authors out there who do that, and myself included. So, I mean, your style of writing, it's an individual thing. But for me, before I write anything new, I tend to read over everything that I've already done to get myself back into the story. And even though you've left it the previous day thinking, that's great, that scene, I wouldn't change a thing. It's remarkable. You'll go back the next day and see all the errors in it, and, you're taking a pen to it. And that's just online. Print it out and read it off, and you'll see what's wrong with the dialogue. So, read it to yourself even, and you can self-edit that way as well. So before you're even coming to send it to any professional editor, you're trying to get it to a position that it's the best that it can be, and that you are thoroughly sickened by looking at it yourself, and that you can't do any more with it, So that's where you want to get to start with, that you have done everything you possibly can with it. And then after that stage, I would say yes, if you are going to allocate funds, certainly do allocate some funds to a professional editor, because, it's what Hazel was saying before, it's your product that you're creating. It is a book, and it's creative, and it's, your baby that you've worked on, but equally it's something that you are wanting to translate into sales eventually as well. So you have to look at it, take off your writing hat and put your business hat on, and this is a business expense, and it's something that's important investing in, I think.
Just maybe for those people who have no idea how to go about that process, what are the nuts and bolts of finding a good editor?
Well, first of all, I think that really depends on the genre that you're writing, because there are editors that are tailored specifically to each genre and have more interest in that and will be better at it. To be honest with you, there's so many out there. It's a question of finding what's right for you, but also not to be put off if you don't find the right editor first time out, because it is, as with anything, it's a professional relationship. And I think that you have to sort of come to an understanding with people so that they understand what you're wanting to do with the book, but also you have to be objective enough to take that critique on board, because not just because you're paying for it, but because you're looking at the long game. It isn't about ego at this point. You have to set that to one side, and you have to look at it afresh, which is what they're trying to do for you. So I think it's a little bit of give and take, and a bit of shopping around as well. I think it's a question of don't be disheartened if it doesn't quite work first time out. You'll find the person who's right for your series.
Okay, and Mark, for you, editing as part of you as a writer?
Yeah, it is crucial. When I started writing, again after the first 2 books, I thought, I don't need to get a proofread, I can do that all myself. That was a really stupid idea, because you won't see the wood for the trees. You've been stuck in a novel for such a long time. We were word blind toward it. So it is an expense, but there aren't many businesses that you can start with no capital outlay. So I'd say that a really good place to find editors, as the traditional industry seems to be growing a little smaller, there are a lot of editors being released. You can go to a kind of an online marketplace. There's a company called Reedsy, reedsy.com, set up by some really nice guys in London, and they effectively are matching creatives with authors, so cover designers, editors, proofreaders, all the kind of professional services that you can find, you can get on a site like that. Another good place is just to ask people, if anyone is writing a thriller and they'd like a reference for a good editor, you can grab me or send me an email. I'm happy to do that. And there are forums where writers hang out, and again, you can do the same thing. A place like Kboards is a very good place to get recommendations too. So I think it's important, but there's no shortage of really good, talented professionals who are ready to help you.
And Hazel, the editing for you?
Yeah, I would definitely, as Louise said, I think it's a business expense, and as I said at the very beginning, ultimately this is about making the book the absolute best book you can make it. So if anything is going to be worth investing in, it has to be in editing. I would, for example, here in Ireland, we have a fantastic resource, writing.ie, our sponsors today, and there are huge amounts of freelance editors. You can contact them, ask them for client references, pick up the books that they've helped edit. If you're comfortable and happy with the work, talk to those authors. There's lots of resource on that website, which I'd highly recommend going to have a look at. But also familiarise yourself a little bit. When I started out, I wasn't really aware of the difference between a structural edit and a line edit, a copy edit, a proof edit. You can't substitute one for the other. You need all of those processes. So do a little bit of reading about the editing process, so that when you do find an editor that you want to use, they will probably ask you, what form of an edit do you want? Do you want a full structural edit of your manuscript? Or are you just looking for the final proof edit? Dotted I's and crossed T's and that really fine detail. So make sure you know exactly what edit you want, and that will depend on the cost of that edit. So that was something I learnt along the way, to know exactly what sort of an edit I was looking for.
Maybe I'll ask as well, because it's another question that comes into the mind of people who are writing perhaps at the very beginning of their careers. What happens when you grind to a halt? What happens when, and most authors will reach a point where they reach a block and everything stops. Is it just different for everybody as to how you get over that?
Yeah, I mean, cry, wail, drink. No, well, I mean, yeah, I don't know anyone who hasn't had a bit of a writer's block at some stage or another, and it's to do with all kinds of things. I mean, it's a creative process, and it's not the same as, the 9-to-5 job that I was doing before, where you might be rolling out pieces of advice, but you're working with material that's already in existence. You are advising on something that's already in existence. Whereas if you're writing a book, you're creating something completely from scratch, that hasn't been in existence before, and that's your intellectual property. So, don't worry too much if it comes a little bit slower some days, or if you have to actually take a week or two to just let things settle, because you are creating something that, from absolutely nothing. So to be consistently creative, I think, is quite difficult. So, you can't necessarily, I mean, I know some people who like to try and write, 3,000 words a day. And that's wonderful if you can do that. And some days, you might be able to write 10,000, other days absolutely nothing. So really just finding what works for you, and trying to get into a good role if you can. But if you have to stop, don't beat yourself up about it. And the good thing about this business is that there is also plenty to do on those days. So if you're not actively writing, there are probably a million other things that you could be doing in terms of creating your author brand, working on your website, looking at your marketing, contacting bloggers, looking around, or in fact, to be honest, reading. So unless it will distract you from what you're currently writing, it's your business is to know what is currently going on in your marketplace. So don't feel that that's a waste of time, or that it's not going back into the actual wider industry. That's something that's time well spent as well.
Okay. Mark, drinking, dancing, rock climbing, what helps break the
all of the above?
logjam?
Drinking. No. I write something else, write something different. So one of the benefits of writing non-sequentially, which is how I tend to do it, is if I'm stuck on one particular scene I don't think is right, and it just isn't coming, I'll go and write something else. So I'll know that, at the 2/3 point, my main character has a conversation with someone else, and maybe some dialogue often unblocks me. So I'll find that writing, it sounds terrible, doesn't it? Anyway, sorry. So just kind of doing something completely different, doing something that is easy, there's a flow to it, that can make a big difference. And then when you've done that, you can go back and do the scene that you were struggling with.
And Hazel?
Gin. It's the only way.
Yeah.
I go for a run, talk to my friends. I think surrounding yourself with writing friends is hugely important, and a lot of my blocks have been unblocked by talking to my friends who can just say, well, why don't you just do that? And you're like, of course. I think all writing blocks really just boil down to self-doubt. It's that fear of, oh, people are actually going to read this, and then people are going to judge me on it. And is it the book I had in my head? Because the book I had in my head was amazing. And is this finished product as good as that? And it probably will never quite live up to what you imagined in your head. So I think you just have to make peace with it, that it is that nagging self-doubt. I do exactly what Mark said. I'll write out of sequence. So I'll jump forward to something I know is going to be amazing and I can't wait to get to, just purely because my writing time is quite limited. And so I have to make the most of all the time I have to write. So I'll jump forward and just write that when I'm first drafting. But yeah, I think you just have to make a little peace with it. Don't worry about it. As Louise said, go and do something else. Come back to it. Go for a run. But yeah, end of the day, glass of wine, gin, chill, be all right.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Maybe just writing hats off, business hats on, again, briefly. Once you actually have what you want out there in the world, you have it written, it's out there, it's done, you then put your business hat back on and you've got to actually promote it in some way, shape or form. And through the media, and I use that term in the broadest sense possible, encompassing online and anything else you can get your hands on. How do you do that?
Well, thinking back to, say, I was just starting out, as I said before, I mean, I had a blog to start with, and I mean, you've got people like, The Marsh and 50 Shades both started as a blog, and it can be enormously successful still. It sounds very rudimentary, but it can still be very successful as an entranceway through into self-publishing. So I had a blog, so that was already kind of up and running, and it's something that, if you do have one, that you have to, put something on there from time to time. It doesn't sort of sit there gathering dust. So that's first of all, but in terms of creating what they call like an author platform. I mean, you have your author page on Amazon as well, which is worth developing, and have a professional image up there, have your biography, simple things like that that make you relatable to people, so that if they are reading your book, they can ask themselves, well, I wonder who wrote this, and you can look it up. And links to your website. Create a website that is accessible, easy to use as well, both mobile and online. If you want to outsource that, you can, but equally there are places like Wix or WordPress that you can go to and create something that looks very professional. And then you've got your Facebooks, Twitters, you can set up profiles on Goodreads, all of the places that really you'll be going to be looking at more regularly as the business moves on. Once you get into some of these social platforms, you can, of course, then look at sort of higher level advertising and marketing campaigns as you get into that. But even just on a very basic level, have your author page set up, because one of the things that I've found with digital publishing, particularly, and probably just the state of publishing in general, is that people like to be able to get in touch. And actually that's really useful as an author to have that kind of instant feedback, because mostly it can be very kind, but even if someone gets in touch to say, I really enjoyed this, but I wasn't sure about this element, that's actually very, very useful feedback, both in reviews and otherwise. And people can be very kind, and they're crossing the street to tell you, look, I really enjoyed something like this. And having those personal connections, it's like Mark was saying previously, in addition to your email list, which is also crucial, and actually to come back to that, at the end of your book that you're putting out there, make sure that you have a link to sign up. If people want to know about updates, that's an ideal platform to have it. They've come to the end of the book, they've really enjoyed it. Oh, look, I can sign up for updates. Fantastic. Sure. So that all links together, and you should have sign-up buttons on your Facebook page as well. Anywhere that you can have one is ideal to have it set up. So go through all of these processes, and it does take a little bit of time first time out, but it's so worth it spending that time, even just on the most basic level.
Okay. Mark?
I'd say get into the mindset that if this is going to be a career for you, then you need to look at your first book as an asset that you can parlay into a greater chance of being successful down the road. So one of the things that I advise new authors to do is to consider giving the first book away for free. So you can do that on most of the retail platforms. You can, I call that a reader magnet. So it's something that you say you'd run a limited Facebook advertising campaign. Doesn't have to be very expensive, and the days are gone, unfortunately, mostly gone, where you can say, sign up to my mailing list and I'll tell you when I'm about my writing day. Emails are very personal information, so you need to sweeten the pill by giving them something that incentivizes them to give that email address to you. So you can run a campaign whereby you target fans in your genre who will be interested in your book. You give them the book as a gift as they join your mailing list. And that will increase your visibility. So the more of those that are happening, your rank will rise on the retail platforms, which means that your next book, everything at that stage starts to play together. So building that list is important, and using the first book as the incentive is a very powerful strategy.
Okay, Hazel.
Absolutely, everything the guys have said. I'd also say, don't forget to get away from the desk and the laptop. That don't market your book purely from sitting there behind a screen. I still think you can't beat getting up and out and about and doing events like this, meeting people. Go to your local library, go to your local bookshops. They might have reading events, author evenings. I think all of those human contact things are still very, very valid. And it is tempting to just do everything online, but do look for opportunities. Become your own publicist and press officer, basically. So if you have a new book coming out, do yourself up a press release, have that short synopsis, put in a few quotes if you've had people read your book and give you what we'd call a blurb, an endorsement. Use that. Do everything you can. Keep in touch with the local newspapers. If there's anything that you do, if you win an award, if you hit a list, whatever that might be, keep refreshing your author bio and keep sending out a new press release, because there's no better news than current news. So keep on top of it. Just one thing with social media, be very, very careful of the hard sell. I know there's a session later on social media, so we'll talk about it more then, but I would always use my passion and my interest in my subject matter to engage with readers. I'd use a lot of imagery, I'd use a lot of articles. I very rarely would say, hey guys, buy my book. It turns people off, it's just too hard and in your face. So I'd caution a lot against doing that. Find softer, gentler ways to engage with those readers who are going to go, oh, I'm really interested in the Titanic as well. I'm really interested in the 1920s. I love that. I'm going to read your book. So you'll probably talk about that a little bit more later. So okay. I think diversity is probably, spread your net widely and see what sticks.
I'd agree with you there, just because I'm not part of that later on. But if I follow an author on social media, I'm fascinated with everything else that they're interested in, not just what they're writing about at the moment, not just their book, but things that they think are interesting too as well. And that makes their social media feeds more interesting.
It makes you more personable and interesting as a person. And that's ultimately going to help drive people to then go and look at your book. And you still can't beat word of mouth.
Yeah. We're going to take questions. Will we start with social? Vanessa, do you have something you want to throw from there?
We had a great question in about how do you write about places that you've never been to? I'll be able to tell you who that's from in a second, but I think that's a good question. How do you do your research? Louise, do you write about places that you've never been to?
Not so far, actually, no. I've always picked somewhere that I've physically been to. But as I say, they're set up in Northumberland, which is close to my heart. And I will, even if I've known them since childhood and it's kind of a memory that I have of them, I will make a trip to see it. But having said that, there are authors out there who very successfully write about places they haven't been to themselves as well. So, I can't speak from personal experience, but I know that it can be done.
I've never been to 1912, 1860, or 1923, but I'd love to. Yeah. I think it all comes down to research. Wherever I can, I'll go and visit a location. So if I set a novel in Covent Garden in London, I'll go and just mooch around because the buildings are still there. If you have time, you can always do a lot of research online. There's amazing websites now. Find museums, go to art, look at art of the era. Read books written in the era that you're writing in, or find local historians if it's a particular place you've never been to. So I think, again, get up and out of the seat. So I time travel in very strange ways.
Okay. I'm going to take questions from the audience if anybody's got one. If you want to put your hand up, there's a roving microphone, so people online will be able to hear us as well. Okay?
Mark, answer that last question, please. Because he writes from all over the world.
Me. Google is your friend. So I wrote, my second novel is set in Juarez, in Mexico, which is, at the time I wrote it, was the murder capital of the world. So it's not somewhere I want to go to research. But Google have sent their little white cars, Street View has been to Juarez. So I was able to, if I was setting a scene in a bar, authenticity is very important to me. So I would effectively just, I'd drive the street virtually by way of their Street View car, and then just.
Going to say you had to go to the bar.
Yeah. So Google is so easy to research these days. There's so many powerful ways to do that.
For those of you who have published directly on Kindle Direct and then gone on to be, published more conventionally, have you found a difference in the engagement with your readers compared to each sort of separate platform? Have you found a difference between the two?
I haven't. I don't think. I mean, it's for me the only difference when I published independently through KDP. It's that element of control and immediacy that you have as an author. You can go and look at you become obsessed, let's be honest, about your sales and your rankings, and you're constantly checking. In terms of the reader experience, I mean, all you want with any form of publishing is to engage with readers who love your work. So for me, it really hasn't been different. I suppose my books are just positioned differently around the world, but I haven't tactically done anything differently to reach readers, no.
Mark?
I think I've had much more reader contact, infinitely more doing this myself. And so my experience with Trad is old now. It's 20 years ago. But I always wanted to get some contact from readers, and I had none. The only time I had any was my second book was called Subpoena Colada. So I was a lawyer at the time, so it's a stupid title. But a friend of mine bought it in a charity shop, which was galling itself, and then kind of gave it to me. Inside the book was a little piece of paper with a reader who obviously knew a little bit about law, had corrected all of my law, which was very embarrassing. But I would have loved to have been able to correspond with that person to say, well, thanks, you're absolutely right, thanks very much for taking the time to do that. But in those days, they had no interest in building author platforms. They didn't really concentrate on that. Whereas these days, it's so easy for readers to get in touch with me. They can do it through Facebook or Twitter, my mailing list. All my books have direct links to my website. So I get 20 or 30 emails from readers every day, and it's quite time-consuming to handle all those. But at the same time, it's one of the things I like the most is to just have that direct contact with readers I never had before.
Okay. And Louise, you've only really done it through KDP.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking there. I mean, I have a German translation of Holy Island that's actually translated through Amazon Crossing, but it's sort of more along the traditional lines in the sense that, it's published along more traditional lines, I should say. So you get kind of a quarterly report, and likewise with the audiobook. So that, I think, mirrors the sort of relationship that you would have with more of a traditional publisher. So for the most part, I've only really known, Amazon KDP, and I'm very happy with that, And so I've always had that reader engagement right from the start. And so I think it would be quite unusual for me now to sort of imagine less of it and sort of going from that model to another. And as I said earlier, I really like hearing from readers to see, how is it being received instantly, because then it's very real to you, isn't it? And it's actually hugely useful going forwards to see whether you're on the right track or not,
I think it's part of the job now that readers want. As a reader, I want to engage with authors, and social media, I think, is the big difference in that. Mm. It's not necessarily which form of publishing, it's that readers can find you, which is good.
Okay, who's next? A lady here and then a gentleman here.
Thank you. Louise, you said something earlier, I think I heard you correctly. When you wrote your novel, you were given offers from a few traditional publishers, but you chose to publish independently.
Yes.
I'd love to know why. And how did you come to that decision?
Well, firstly, so I had an offer from, I think at the time it was an agent and a publisher that was accepting direct submissions. But you have to bear in mind that the ones that I'd applied to, some of them were very small. And the question became things like distribution or marketing. And really what Mark went on to talk about, through his experience, because I think that realistically, as a brand new author, untried, and for me being a second career as well, there was a level of impatience there. I would like to see that it would go on and be read, because I wanted it to be the case that, there would be a big stack of my books on the first table as you walk into Waterstones, but realistically that just wasn't going to happen. So, from that initial, punching the air moment, woohoo, where do I sign? You sort of step back and think, well, hang on a minute, I'm not in a position like J.K. Rowling was to leverage her kind of existing success into any further books. I was starting out completely afresh, and there were no guarantees on anything like distribution, and you're having to hand over your rights for quite a long period of time as well. And I was a bit nervous about that. I thought, well, actually, a lot can happen in that intervening time. So actually, it was my husband who said, well, have you thought about Amazon KDP? And again, I have to say I was very ignorant at the time. I had no idea about it. So we looked into it. I had a Kindle myself, and enjoy using the Kindle as a reader. And so the more that I looked into it, it was kind of a no-brainer for me because, they're hugely, beneficial rights for authors. I use KDP Select, which means that you get the higher royalty rate as well. And you keep all of your rights. You have instant access to make any of those changes that you want to change. You do become responsible, obviously, in a business sense for being your own publisher because you have to market it. You're in charge of your image, your branding, and all of those things that we're going to be talking about today. But for me, that was something that was important to be in charge of how those books would go. I had a very clear idea of what I wanted to do with them.
Okay, gentleman here in the front row.
We've talked a lot already about free forms of publicity, such as social media, mailing lists. what's your experience been with forms of paid advertising, whether it's Facebook, Google Ads, journals or magazines, or even hiring a publicist or anything like that?
I've only very limited experience. I would use boosted Facebook ads, just of a Facebook post that I do. So that would be more when I have one of my titles on a price drop, and I would just do a graphic, or my publisher would do a graphic, and I just boost that then, so it expands the reach, which is another great way to just help direct your books to the right readers. So I haven't done paid advertising in journals or print or anything like that. So that's my limited. It's definitely worth doing the Facebook boosted
Mark, you're
post.
vigorously shaking your head there. Vigorously.
Boosted posts is a bad idea.
It's worked for me.
Okay, I can. Well, the way to. I'm well known in the space for being big on Facebook advertising. I spent about £250,000 last year on Facebook ads, but I made twice that back. So it's the thing with it is very powerful, but it's easy to waste money if you don't do it right. But the thing with advertising using targeted Facebook ads is that my books are compared to the books of, say, Lee Child, James Patterson, people like that, Baldacci. I can send an ad, because Facebook knows all of this and knows what you like. I could send an ad to you as a Lee Child fan saying, do you like Jack Reacher? And I know the answer to that question is yes. Facebook's already told me that. And knowing that that's a potential, a reader who's going to be interested in the kind of books that I'm writing, I'm immediately making it more likely that they'll follow through and maybe download the free book that I'm offering, or a box set of books, or a book that I'm selling. I teach courses on Facebook ads for authors now, and we've had one guy called Adam Croft, who was a KDP author. He had one book called Her Last Tomorrow, and he's projecting to make £1 million this year on that one book through an extensive Facebook ads campaign. So it's not all profit. But it does work. It's really powerful. I wouldn't worry. I think buying ads in print, I think that's probably not effective these days. The tools for online advertising now are so sophisticated. That would be where I'd be focusing on.
Louise?
I'm kind of in Hazel's camp on this, to be honest. It's something that I am looking to explore, likewise with Amazon Marketing Services in the US, because the US is an emerging market for me, because I'm kind of mostly in the UK and Europe, and say like Australia and India. So US is something that I'm looking at, and I think that Amazon Marketing Services in particular in the US could be quite a powerful tool to explore. So that's something I myself, again, I'm only 2 years into this industry, and you learn all the time. It's changing so constantly that there is a lot to sort of keep up to date with, but things like this can be really useful for that. So likewise with Facebook advertising, I think that, I think for a lot of people it can be, and myself included, it can be quite daunting, because it is, as Mark says, such a powerful tool. But there are a lot of, free websites, there are a lot of things that you can do to sort of educate yourself around it. And that comes back to that business side of it, that, you need to be fairly hands-on with these things. But to the extent to which you go into it is entirely up to you. For me, I have been fortunate in the sense that all 4 have been bestsellers, and I haven't employed a campaign like that yet, but it's something that you can then use again in the future. So it's increments of what you want to do.
Okay, we're almost running out of time. We can take one more from social. Vanessa.
Okay, so Mega Potential wants to know whether we're just going to track back a little bit to the start of the session. Whether you all started out by blogging. Mark, you didn't start out by blogging. I think the 2 girls did. So, you did explain earlier that you started off sort of as a lawyer. What was your first platform, I suppose, for the book?
God, that's a long time ago now. The original books, the 2 traditionally published books, that was the traditional campaign. So they did what they do, which wasn't very much in my case. The first independently published book I had out was called The Black Mile, and I did what I tell people not to do. I basically put it up there, close my eyes, cross my fingers, and that doesn't work very well. It didn't work then, and it certainly doesn't work now. Blogging is one way to do it. As Andy Weir has been mentioned, the author of The Martian, started out that way. It's not something for me. I think that blogging takes quite a lot of time to you're actually writing something when you could be writing something creative, an asset that you can sell. But if you like blogging, it's certainly something that you can look to do.
And Hazel?
Something I really fell into. It was a route for me to, as I said, find my voice. I found something I wanted to write about. I I suppose my blogging it was very different to the subjects that I now write about in my novels. But I always say any form of writing is a great way to exercise that muscle. So if it's a short story, if it's an article for the local paper, if it's part of an anthology, a novel is a huge, daunting beast of a thing. And it takes a long time to finish it. So do lots of other things. And that's what I loved about blogging. And you get that immediate feedback from people who were reading my blog and engaging with other bloggers. So I felt as if I was part of a writing community whilst I was working on my novel sort of secretly, quietly in the middle of the night. So just look for opportunities to write and try different forms of writing. I think they're all very valid and can all help that creative flow as well.
I think it's also a really good way to test the hook that you were talking about earlier, because in my case, you know, I hadn't blogged before. I did set it up, you know, as Hazel's saying, just to sort of test the muscle a bit. But also, as I was starting to come to the conclusion of my first draft of Holy Island, I thought, well, maybe it's time to sort of put a little bit of that out there. It was terrifying, but at that point in time, I only had a limited number of readers, and I thought, well, that's fine, you know, hope no harm, no foul. Someone can come back and say, I hate it, and not many people have seen it so far, so that's fine. So I put a snippet up there, and then all of the comments came through, and it was encouraging. I thought, okay, let's try this bit now. And, you know, it's a way to test reactions before you have a wider readership as well. It's just a nice little kind of beta reader group, I suppose, is the way of putting it.
Okay. Sadly, I think our time is up. I'm going to be back a little bit later on one of our other panels. The next panel online in a few minutes is going to be the art of editing. It's also going to be in the room, by the way, so don't go anywhere. But can I ask you please to put your hands together for LJ Ross, for Mark Dawson, and for Hazel Gaynor.